Ellis cursed and threw himself at the broken pressure line with a bit of copper and a roll of inner tube. He jammed and lashed and the pump shuddered back to life. Water surged. The child, Ren's child, sipped and slept, and some part of me that had hardened like coal softened. People cheered like drowning men grabbing a ladder. The sanctum staggered, less in power than in the sudden arithmetic of what we had done. We had chosen water. The mist did not leave. If anything, it crowded the edges like a jury not yet ready to decide. It sniffed the warm water and the scent of living things. It tasted of promise and clung like steam. In the control room, a man with a blade lunged and found nothing but the pump's steady churn and the kitchen of his own terror. Without the radio, the signal was gone. With the pump on, something new hummed in the air. Mara stood with a coil in one hand and a child's head on her knee. She looked at me with the kind of tiredness that is more honest than rage. "You did the right thing," she said, and I almost laughed because I had spent years arguing myself into and out of rightness. We ran the plant in shifts for the next 2 days, the generator coughing and being coaxed into the rhythm of sacrifice. The water flowed into barrels and into people's mouths and into kidneys that had been shrunken by drought. We sent caravans with jerry cans to towns in the radius we could support. We taught someone to mend a membrane. We wrote a schedule on a scrap of sheet metal and nailed it to a support beam. Pump cycles, watch shifts, filter change. The plant took on the air of a small city waking up. And I sat by the pump at night with my hands on a wrench and thought about voice. The radio was a silence now, a hollow that a man could fall into. I had given up the transmitter, and with it the habit of being a lighthouse in order to become a well. The calculus was brutal, to be a pulse of information to many or a pulse of water to dozens. I had chosen hands over voice. That choice cost me things I can't name without opening up the wound, but it also bought a life I could measure cup by cup. The climax of it all was not a triumph in the old sense. It was a slow, stuttering renunciation and an acceptance. I traded the filament of my speaking for the steady, cold flow of water. When the mist settled the next dawn, it seemed less sulky, as if a bargain had been made that no one could quite explain. The sanctum moved on, perhaps recalculating their theology. The scraps came once more, and we traded them food for watch duty instead of letting them take it by force. People came with coils and batteries like offerings. Mara took up a post and trained 3 others to keep the membranes from fouling. Ren's child learned to laugh again at the sight of a dripping hose. There was a last, small thing I did before I let my hands go from the valve for good. I pulled the microphone out of its housing and wrapped Lena's scarf around it. I spoke into it without making a signal, murmuring my list of names: Tommy, Mara, Ellis, Ren, until the metal hummed and my voice was only for the room. It felt like prayer and maintenance at once. I do not know if I will ever have Station 7 back. Maybe someone will rig a transmitter on the far ridge, and my voice will leak out again across the dunes. Maybe I have written my last schedule and my last list. All I know is that water ran tonight where it did not run yesterday. The choice to trade sound for water is the kind of moral arithmetic that is messy and entirely human. It did not make me a saint. It made me tired and quiet and, for the first time in a very long while, clean. If you are listening, if any of you pick the radio up by some miracle when it rises again, if you hear my voice somewhere else, know this. We found a well in the ruin by choosing to be less, and in that less we found enough. Keep your names written. Keep your water covered. Keep listening if you can. If you can't, drink. For the first week after Bluewell, the plant felt like a new kind of miracle, one that smelled of diesel and wet metal and the sour, honest sweat of people who had not slept because they were keeping something alive. We ran on a schedule that was scribbled on scrap metal and nailed to a beam like scripture. 2 hours on, 4 hours off. Filters checked at dawn. Watch at dusk. Rotate the membranes every 5 cycles. It was clumsy and terrible, and it worked. Barrels filled and caravans left full. A boy who had gone 3 days without a proper drink came to the tank and wept until his father pressed him to silence because, Crying in public is a dangerous display of vulnerability in these times. I have never been ashamed of tears like that before. The immediate outcome was this: people lived who might have died. That is the simplest honest sentence I can string. Ren's child recovered enough to eat. Mara's seedlings survived the humidity spike because we learned to stagger the pump cycles to lower salt load. And 3 weeks later, she had enough greens to barter for a repaired alternator and a spool of copper. The traders who had at first drugged their feet began to bring things other than rumors. Panels, an old alternator someone had kept for a wedding grill and now offered for a crate of water. The scraps learned a new habit: watch duty in exchange for canned goods, because the math of steady food outweighed the thrill of sudden theft. But the cost was not invisible. The transmitter's light on Station 7 stayed dark. I could lie and say the silence was a sacrifice I expected, noble like a burned flag, but that would be a lie, and I will not waste air on prettiness. The quiet of the radio is a new kind of hunger. There are nights I lie awake and imagine a frequency alive, feel the weight of names on my tongue that no one hears, and taste absence as plainly as I taste metal. Without the steady practice of speaking, some of my sentences have become rusted, and at the edges of my mouth I lose the words that used to keep people company. The community recalibrated in ways both small and big. We learned to rotate knowledge as well as labor. Ellis taught 3 men how to field strip a pump. Mara taught 2 more hands the ritual of the membranes. A retired schoolteacher, who'd found her voice again in the sound of children practicing counting near the water barrels, began writing lists of supply recipients so food wouldn't be hoarded by those with louder voices. We started a ledger not just for goods but for promises: who fixed a roof and who was owed 2 hours of watch. Trust did not return in buckets, but it grew in stitches. People paid back favors with labor. People left notes under stones when they went out on long runs. Little things that meant we could rely on one another again. The environmental picture did not change overnight. The sea was still a rumor at the edge of the world, salt in the soil and tidal ghosts in the low places. The sky browned on windless days and the mist still had its ways. But Bluewell introduced a microeconomy of stability. Where there was steady water, life braced itself with a little more certainty. A river of people, small at first, began to learn that if they showed up with skills, they could be part of keeping the plant alive. That's how slow recovery begins. Not with nations or treaties, but with the practical distribution of competence. A woman who mended boots became the person who always had a spare cot. A young man who had scavenged old radio parts learned soldering and now made a living keeping the solar array patched. Still, not everything that blooms survives. There were losses that the water could not fix. The sanctum did not disappear. They drifted away from the plant after a few tense confrontations, but their philosophy spread like a bruise. They found new pulpits where fear had hollowed people out and preached doctrines that rounded scarcity into righteousness. Some towns bowed and surrendered small pumps rather than risk violence. Others, handed a choice between a sermon and a repair kit, chose the sermon because belief promised a narrative that pain did not. That is the cruel arithmetic of catastrophe. Supply only goes where someone shouts the loudest, and sometimes the loudest are the cruelest. The mist remained the wild card. It approached Bluewell like a jealous cousin. It tested seals and slid into every crack the way a thought slips into memory. Sometimes it brought hallucinations that caused people to wander toward dunes at night. Sometimes it left a faint ring of frost on the filter housings, as if it were trying to baptize the plant into a creature of its own. We learned tricks: salt scrubbing the intake, running short saline flushes, building curtains of coiled wire to break up the mist's pattern. But nothing was a cure. The plant was a dent in the world's collapse, not a repair. Inside me, the change felt less mechanical and more like a slow heaving of bones. I had spent years proving to myself that speaking was the thing that defined me. The voice that announced weather and read lists was the only tether I had to a pre-collapse identity. Giving the generator away, giving my voice, felt like losing a limb and discovering a new one in its place. I began to sleep in short bursts again, but the sleep was different. It was heavier with the work of repair, lighter with the kind of fatigue that comes from honest labor. Guilt lived in the margins of that labor. When we sent water to a settlement that later turned out to be a trap for the scraps, when a caravan we helped organize never returned because the bridge they crossed gave way, those moments folded into me like small knives. I have a habit of naming losses aloud. The station used to be where I did it. Now I name them softly by the pump or on the scrap of metal where the schedule hangs. It's different, less performative, more necessary. So what did I learn in the falling days? That choices are rarely pure and often necessary. That the world does not restore itself because you ask it politely. That people are both worse and better than you expect. Worse when pushed to the edge of survival. Better when someone hands them a wrench and teaches them how to use it. I learned that hope is not a destination but a practice. The careful tending of a pump, the teaching of a child how to wind an antenna, the sharing of a spool of copper, because in a week you may need a hand to hold for you. We replaced some transmissions with other rituals. Instead of radio shows, we practiced a schedule of bells at dawn and dusk, 3 peals for water distribution, 2 for watch change. A kid learned to play a tune on a battered harmonica, and it became a call for meals. People left chalk marks on shelter doors to indicate health and hunger. These small, human systems became a different kind of network. No bandwidth, but enough to connect people when voices could not. The ecological news was mixed. In the immediate radius of Bluewell, the dust settled a little at dusk because water kept loose soil from becoming airborne. A tiny population of insects reappeared near standing pools, and with them came the hesitant flutter of birds later in the month. That is how ecosystems attempt repair, small migrations into niches that suddenly exist because of human intervention. But on the larger scale, the atmosphere still behaved irregularly. Storms came with new geometry. Heat waves hit with increasing duration. We were not curing the planet. We were buying time in a few places. Sometimes I think the most honest way to say it is this: Bluewell did not save the world. It bought us evenings where mouths could be washed and seeds could be started, nights where children could sleep without collapsing with thirst. It taught a cluster of people how to repair machines and how to distribute kindness, which in a world of failing systems is a radical act. My internal reckoning is quieter now. I no longer measure myself by airtime. I measure by the number of barrels filled, by the neatness of a repaired membrane, by the list of names on the ledger that are crossed out because they were either fulfilled or because the person left and we never saw them again. The change is not noble. It's an honest re-anchoring of purpose. I sometimes miss the old ritual of reading names into the static, hearing someone somewhere murmur back, a tiny proof that we were more than our wounds. But the pump hums where the voice used to be, and the hum is enough for now. It is a different kind of proof. I still hold Lena's scarf sometimes, and I still wrap it around the microphone when the children are practicing counting near the tanks. It hangs there like a relic and a tool both. There are nights I sit by the pump and talk to it in a language halfway between prayer and maintenance. I tell it the names of people I miss. It does not answer in words, only in the steady drip and the slow, patient rise of water in a barrel. In time, we will try to get the airwaves back. There are men tinkering with an old transmitter at the far ridge who say they can rig a low-power banner to reach caravans moving across the flats. Maybe I will be the one to climb up and speak again. Maybe someone else will take my place behind a microphone and invent new names for the world. Both things can be true. For now, the falling action has given us a new shape of life, less dramatic, more accountable. We measure survival by the arithmetic of water and the politics of trust. We have hope in the form of filled barrels and people who now know how to fix a filter. We carry the knowledge that every choice, broadcast or pump, comes with a consequence. The world is still losing parts of itself. The mist still learns new tricks. The sanctum still angles for control. The scraps still smell weaknesses and test them. But in one small place, under rusted roofs and beside a battered pump, we bought a few more mornings. That is enough to begin again. It is a thread, not a rope, a single stitch in a garment being mended. I tend the plant and I name the small victories aloud. It is a modest liturgy. A repaired seal, a clean membrane, a child who drinks and laughs. Those victories collect like coins. They can be spent on another day. If you are listening when the radio returns, I hope you will hear more than static. I hope you will hear the names of people who kept a pump running through nights thicker than anything we had before. If you never hear my voice again, then remember this. We made a choice, ugly and human, and for a while the water ran. Keep your names written. Keep your hands learning. Keep the small systems that matter going. That is how the world, whatever shape it will have left, will start to stitch itself back together. One stubborn, necessary act at a time. They say endings are tidy things, bows tied and curtain calls. Life rarely gives you tidy endings. What I have found instead is a rhythm. Small victories stitched between losses, a ledger that balances in a way that never feels finished. If this story needs a final note, make it this. We did not win. We survived one more day, and sometimes that is the same thing. After Bluewell, mornings tasted of metal and something like possibility. Children learned to splash without the look of shock on their faces. Garden beds that had only been rumor sprouted green. People traded lessons as much as they traded bolts and beans. We are a make-do people, and the work of making do is a kind of stubborn, quiet triumph. But that stubbornness is not the same as certainty. The pump hums, the sky still bruises with storm. The mist still remembers voices it shouldn't. Hope sits beside fear, and most nights they share a thermos. Giving the radio away, that is the thing that changes me most deeply. I thought I would die if I could not speak into a transmitter and hear a voice answer back from the dark. I feared silence more than hunger for a long time. Now my speech has different weight. I speak to hands as much as to ears. I teach them to solder, to patch membranes, to listen for the sound of a bearing that needs oiling. Sometimes my words are practical. Change the filter at dawn. Do not run the pump for more than 40 minutes on one cycle. Sometimes the words are smaller and harder. Tell the people you love that you love them. Keep a list of names near water. Both kinds keep a kind of life going. What did I lose? The station light, for one. The way my voice carried felt like a compass, and without it I am more human than I am hero. I lose the reach I had. Warnings that might have saved someone miles away, a joke that would have loosened a stern face. I miss reading names into the static and imagining a hand somewhere reaching to write one down. There are nights I wake and pat the microphone out of habit, feel the empty space of it like an ache. That ache is honest. It reminds me how much being heard mattered. What did I gain? A different kind of belonging. Bluewell is not salvation. It is an argument we made with the ruin and won a few lines of it back. It brought people whose hands can fix engines and whose heads remember school primers. It taught us rules, the slow, patient rules of maintenance and of fairness. It made us barter labor for survival in a way that taught people to trust again, slightly, enough to let someone else hold a wrench. The world outside still moves like an animal with a limp. Heat will come this summer with the old arrogance. Storms will write new geographies across the flats. The sea will keep pressing at the coasts in incrementally louder ways. The mist will keep inventing tricks. There are places we cannot reach, towns that have been taken apart by raiders, communities that have turned inward and hoarded their last seeds. Recovery, if that word applies at all, is a collection of local repairs. It is daisies pushing through cracks, a child learning to whistle again, a woman teaching another how to splice wire under a lamp. I think about the practical future because practical things are what I can do. We will keep the pump schedule. We will expand the training program Mara started. 3 hands who can solder are more powerful than 1 man with a radio. We will keep the ledger honest and public. We will plan supply runs with watch pairs and leave clear markers so no one wanders blind into mist-heavy valleys. If you can, keep writing names down. Names make us harder to forget, and a personal reckoning I carry now. Some things are for the many, others for the few. I learned that when you have a filament that can light 1,000 miles of warning or a pipe that can water 100 mouths, you are making a moral choice every time you turn a valve or flip a switch. There is no innocence in those choices, only the messy, human calculus of which life you can give weight to in the moment. I will be quieter about the guilt now. Guilt hollows you out. Use it once, use it to set a standard and then build. If there is a last message I want to send, one I would have spoken into any microphone or written onto any scrap, it is this. Keep your names written. Keep your water covered. Teach a neighbor how to splice a wire. Share a ration not because it makes you noble, but because it makes you safer. Do not trade your future for the promise of a rumor without a map or a person who can show you how the gears actually fit. Hope is fragile, treat it like a lamp. Feed it with small, steady things, knowledge, labor, honest trade, and it will burn longer than any one of our single sacrifices. We are not the last song on the air. Maybe there will be another station. Maybe someone on a ridge will rig a transmitter that will catch a breeze and send out a voice that sounds like mine. If that happens, I hope it brings more than warnings. I hope it brings instruction and music, and the names of people who kept a pump running through nights when everything else wanted to go dark. If you are reading this on paper, in a notebook, or if you are the one who finally re-raises the microphone and hears the ghost of Station 7, remember that the work that matters is not dramatic. It is the splicing of 2 wires in a cold dawn. It is the slow, patient change of filters. It is sitting with someone whose hands are shaking and showing them how to steady them. Those are the heroic acts now. I do not promise that things will get better in the grand way the old stories promised. I promise instead this smaller truth, that as long as we keep our hands learning and our lists honest and our lamps fed, there will be mornings when a child can drink without fear. That is enough to go on. That is a kind of future. This is Thomas Rook. I will keep my hands busy, my ledger honest, and my scarf wrapped around the old microphone like a flag. If the air finds a way to carry my voice again, I will speak. If it doesn't, I will let the pump speak for a while and call that answer enough. Stay alive. Keep your names. Keep the small systems that matter. We will meet again in some way, one day, over water or over static. Until then, keep listening, by whatever means you can. No one could explain it with certainty. The scholars, those who call themselves the keepers of craft and pattern, burned through entire rooms of text, trying to devise rules. They found old diagrams that predicted strain in the circuit under rare conditions, but nothing that accounted for voices that should never have existed. Others, more practical and bent, suggested simple decay, that the crystal lattice of the stones was wearing thin and leaking. Decay, after all, is less frightening as an explanation. It is inert, treatable, measurable. Yet there were nights when explanation felt inadequate. In the quietest hours, when the halls of a Craftworld narrowed to a single breath, there were stones that did not merely flicker, they whispered. Whispers come in many kinds. There are the whispers that comfort, old jokes, half-forgotten lullabies, the names of lovers. There are the whispers that instruct, tactical calls remembered from 1,000 battles, warnings carved into the fabric of a mind. And then there are the whispers that unsettle, names called backwards, phrases recited in a tempo that feels like a heartbeat that does not belong to you, and the slow, relentless counting of things that cannot be counted. The elders refuse to say what those last whispers sound like. They close their mouths and speak of other things because language loses itself in their telling. But if you must know, if you insist on hearing the small particulars, the whispers are like a sea of small knives, precise, deliberate, always moving. They insinuate themselves into dreams and alter the rhythm of breathing. They call to things that were not meant to be called. They make the mind hungry in ways that are not hunger at all. It was into this trembling hour that a young seer was born. Her given name is thin and private. Among her tutors she was called Elano. She was not an unusual child by the standards of her people. She had the usual gifts: a quick mind, a sensitivity to the subtlest pattern, a heart that could fold a melody into a single gesture. She loved the small architecture of craft, the way a line could balance an entire facade, the way a chord could make a room breathe. Yet something in Elano's dreams set her apart. Even as a girl, she would wake with her hands stained by color she had not seen, and with the faint taste of someone else's laughter upon her tongue. She would touch the spirit stone at her bedside and feel two presences, one her own, patient and bright, the other a colder thing, like someone's shadow leaning close to read a book. Her tutors taught her to be cautious. They taught her the disciplines of silence, how to let a thought pass through without touching it, how to braid herself shut so that the circuit would not become a temptation. They gave her exercises: to thread a melody meant to damn, to place a sigil of frost beneath her pillow, to practice moving in circles so her mind would not grow straight with hunger. She performed these tasks dutifully. She learned to keep her hands still when the world inside her started to hum. For a while, the small rituals were enough. The stone at her bedside glowed its even, familiar light. The infinity circuit cooed like a far-off bell. The world remained within tolerable bounds. And then the whispers began. It was subtle at first, a fragment, a syllable that might have been anything. She was in the library, a room of preserved thoughts where the vault is lined with old patterns, and she reached for a file, a small thing about garden formation on a distant exotic world. The air smelled faintly of earn bloom, and there was a light breeze without windows. She folded the corners of the page and the paper felt as if it were breathing. When she touched the margin, she heard, as clearly as a bell, a voice that was not her tutor's nor any elder she recognized. It was small and soft and made no coherent sound at first, merely a pressure at the edge of comprehension. The voice said something like a name, but the vowels were wrong. They were inverted as if someone spoke through glass and the glass had rearranged the grammar of the sky. Elano froze. Her hand remained poised over the page. The book hummed. The spirit stones in the nearest wall brightened, then dimmed. For a second she felt the peculiar sensation of someone looking at her from inside the page. She told herself it was fatigue. She told herself the circuit's hum had caused residue from an older pattern to float into her mind. She took a breath and reminded herself of her training. She pushed the sensation away like a drifting mote. Yet in the days that followed, the sensation returned, each time with more insistence. A single sound turned into a phrase turned into a string of names. And the names, the most honest thing about any soul, began to arrive in a form no living Eldar had taught their children. They came in reverse. There is an old superstition among the Eldar about the way names work. A name is not merely a label. It is a string of soul notes folded to fit an identity. To say a name in reverse is to unweave that fabric, to expose seams best left hidden. Children are taught to shield their names with sigils. Lovers sometimes whisper private nicknames in secret so they cannot be taken. To hear your own name spoken backwards within your ear is to sense the lock trying to turn inside the bone. Elano began to hear them everywhere. They were not always her own. They came from the walls, from the alcoves, from the spirit stones mounted in the gallery. Her nights filled with private echoes. Lani, Erno V, Simul G. Sometimes the reverse name would be almost affectionate, a tongue twist of intimacy. Other times it sounded like teeth grinding on glass. When she mentioned it to a tutor, the older woman frowned and dismissed the comment as childish fancy. To admit that you hear names unmade is to call attention to the very thing the elders avoid. The elders are careful with words because naming something gives it a place to rest. They feared giving a home to the wrong things. So Elano kept her mouth shut. She kept watch in the small rooms and learned to count her breaths during the long hours. But secrecy is itself a kind of pressure. You fold a secret into your chest and it presses like a stone. The pressure finds other ways to express itself. In dreams, in restless hands, in a sudden compulsion to stand at the edge of a balcony at dawn and call out to the sky. One dawn she did exactly that. The Craftworld's outer terraces face the same stars that watch everything on the long, slow curve of its voyage. The light there is thin and hard. She stood with a small cup in her hand, the cup still warm from tea, and she listened. The infinity circuit thrummed below her feet. A spirit stone worn on the railing flashed its light and then stilled. A name brushed her like a moth's wing. It came from the webway itself, or so she would tell herself later. It was spoken quietly, and it was not Alanal's, but it slid along her spine as if written there. Nala E. She felt a hand that was not hers lift the cup to her lips and spill a drop on the stone. The drop evaporated before it touched the crystal. She did not leap back. She simply turned and walked away as if she had been expecting the hand to take the cup. Inside, her breath trebled. She felt a small laugh, not hers, rise like steam from the hollow of her stomach. When she reached the library, she sat and folded her hands in her lap and tried, with all the slow grace of ritual, to breathe properly. More stones began to behave oddly after that. Not all but some, the older ones, the ones kept near the circuit's core. At night they would flare, thin as a lighthouse and almost painful to behold. In the dark, Alanal would feel their warmth, and within that warmth something would whisper backwards. A question, an invitation, a tiny arithmetic of remembrance. They said not only names but requests as well. Eva H, Rova F. The sounds were like small worms of glass, bright and sharp. She began to keep watch at the circuit's rim. There the hum is a living thing, louder, more complex, a chorus of trapped selves. From its edge, the web of spirit stones spreads like a net. The stones there are closer to memory, and therefore closer to hazard. She sat and watched them, listening for the place where the whisper's shape changed. It was the night a faint smear of darkness clung to the web like oil that she first heard the thing that would not be a mere flicker. At first she thought it a trick of light. The spirit stones tuned themselves to produce a slow, common vibration, and one among them went still as if holding its breath. Then another answered with the wrong note, and then, as if a hand had passed through the mesh, a shadow moved in the circuit's weave. She stood. The air smelled like burnt cedar and ozone. The webway's throat, that old route between stars where minds pass like swimmers, whispered back. And within it she heard a voice that was not layered over other voices but beneath them, as if something ancient had paused to clear its throat. The voice was not human or Eldar, it was architecture given sound. It spoke one word reversed, and the sound folded the memory. It did not call a name, it called a pattern. Alanal fell to her knees. In the days that followed, she tried to describe it and found language failing her. She found herself tracing diagrams in the air with fingers that trembled. She approached others. A farseer with a hand more skilled at prophecy than compassion. A wraithcraft engineer who had been alive during the first fluxes after the fall. Some nodded solemnly. Some refused to speak. None offered comfort. The engineer said only after a long pause, "The webway is old. It takes what it needs." That statement, simple, almost trivial, lodged like a pebble behind her ribs. Took what it needs. The words reduced the problem to appetite, which was in one way reassuring. Appetite is predictable. You can see how it grazes and plan around it. But it was not only appetite. The voice in the webway spoke with a knowledge of names unmade. It knew how to peel them. Alanal began to dream of rooms that unmade themselves. She dreamt of corridors that rearranged in the middle of a thought, of doorways that opened onto gatherings of people who had never lived. In the dreams, she would sometimes see her own reflection, and the reflection would be returning the wrong name. Lena E, it would say, and the syllables would fall into her mouth like stones. People began to notice her changing, the careful stoop of her shoulders, the way she sometimes stared too long at a stone without blinking. Friends stepped a little farther away from her in the council halls, as if avoiding a pattern they might accidentally wake. That simple social distancing felt like a wound. Elanel felt a deeper loneliness than she had known before. She had become, for some, an omen or a curiosity, and the roles were slippery. Was she haunted, or was she a herald? The more she resisted, the more insistent the voices grew. They come not only from stones but from the webway's cracks, small tears in the ancient roots architecture where something could whisper through. When a mind travels through the webway, it leaves behind a scent, a pattern of motion within the warp. The webway remembers movement the way the sea remembers a boat's wake. For reasons unbeknownst, some wakes are sticky. They leave behind threads that slow other minds, and those threads have begun to thrum with a new melody. Sometimes the melody is a memory that does not belong to those who hear it. It is a recollection of celebration that never took place, a feast that existed only in a mind's stray wish. It wraps itself around a living soul and suggests, gently, dangerously, "Come taste." And if the soul gives an inch, the melody takes a foot and then the rest. Elanel watched as others grew wary of travel through certain webway routes. Trade slowed along those veins. Exotic pilgrims once came and left like wind. Now they send only small delegations, cautious and quick. The small armies that patrol the brighter paths through the webway keep their patrols shorter. The Craftworld limned its course slowly, and sometimes the captain would order a course change to avoid a region of heavy memory thrum. But avoidance is not always possible. There are places in the webway that cannot be bypassed. Junctions, anchors, the bones of roots that tie Craftworlds together. At these places, the hum intensifies. The spirit stones there are in constant motion, shifting like a school of fish. There was one such junction near which Elanel took a watch for many nights. On those nights, the circuit sang in its deepest register. The stones pressed close, bristling light into one another like quilled combs. The webway, in its lambent secrecy, seemed to inhale and then hold, like a mouth pausing before a bite. Elanel stood with her hands folded against the cool rail and watched, and she began to understand a terrible geometry. The reverse names were not accidents but invitations. They were hooks, shaped to fit the lip of a mind. If a mind found itself recognized in reverse, it would tilt, and in the tilt it would give the webway a shape to remember. The webway, hungry as ever, would learn that shape and call it again. On the 8th night, the call was for her. It began simply with a flicker among the stones. One stone flashed, then another, then a linked pair. A hum settled into the core, and she felt it like someone lowering a hand onto a small animal's back. The voice was not a voice then, but a pressure, a particular arrangement of warmth and brightness. It was both intimate and cunning, like a hand balanced on the hilt of a knife. "Lena E," it breathed. She answered with ritual. She recited old sigils that are taught to children as songs. She drew a circle in the dust and traced the marks the elders recommend for safety. A small seal to damp low-frequency impulses, a knot to bind the stone's sound. The elders teach these things in case of weak memories. They are not made for a thing that speaks the wrong way. The seal held for a heartbeat, then flicked. The circuit's core threw a noise, high and animal, and the light in the stones pooled into a single, bright node. Elanel's hands shook. The call came again, this time layered, a harmony reversed upon itself, a memory sung inside out. "Lena E," the webway sang, and with the sound there came a sense of hands at her shoulders, not her hands. A pressure like a smile. In that instant, her training bent under the sheer familiarity of the sound. The call had the cadence of a lullaby her mother had once hummed, the timbre of a corner of laughter she had held in childhood. It wrapped itself around the lock of her name and began to turn it gently inside. The seal bristled and then, impossibly, warmed. Her knees gave. She felt herself leaning into the sound. The worst part, the part every tutor fears but never admits, is that the moment of yielding is not violent. It is tender. It is almost kind. You think you are reaching for a hand offered in friendship, not a claw that will take you. At the last instant, something inside her snapped awake. A flicker of logic, the narrow, animal part of cognition that habitually checks for traps, flared. She realized she had been listening to a pattern meant not to inform but to unmake. With the clarity of panic, she began to recite the counterchant she had learned as a child. A string of small, sharp stops, a rhythm to carve a space between herself and the song. Her voice sounded thin in the great halls. It trembled and yet held. The call recoiled. For a moment the stones went white-hot and then dim. An engineer later would describe the effect as a standing wave briefly collapsed under interference. Elanel would remember it as a kind of vomiting of sound, a heap of harmonics that then scattered like broken glass. The aftertaste was metallic. She tasted not herself but a smear of someone else's wine on her tongue, and the memory of a hand that had not touched her. For a long time she could not stand. When she finally rose, the elders were there, as if they had been watching for the precise point of control failure. They spoke to her then in the language of measured pity and cold protocol. They praised her training and scolded her boldness. They told her she had done well and that the circuit had been touched by some defect in the webway's weave. They offered words of comfort, but their faces were thin with fear. In their eyes she saw the recognition. Whatever had reached for her was not new. It had found fingers before. They recorded the night as an event of caution, an anomaly in the infinity circuit. They sealed off access to the junction for 3 weeks and then 5, then an undetermined number. They placed additional runes. They set patrols. The official word was restraint and analysis. The unofficial, the whisper in the corridors, was hunger. Elanel slept little. She dreamed of names spun like thread and of doors that opened inward on skin that was no longer body. She dreamed that, every time she closed her eyes, a slight thing at the edge of her vision turned its head to look at her, as if to learn the facets of her face. In the dream it was patient, as only hunger can be when unopposed. There are ways to live with such knowledge. You can teach yourself to move slightly differently, to never pass a stone without dropping a small sigil, to sing off-key when you cross a threshold so your mind isn't wholly present. You can choose to stay away from crowded memories and keep your life small. Some do. Some will gesture at a modest life and be content. Others do not get that choice. For Elanel, the knowledge that the webway was learning names, unmaking and remaking them as hooks, grew like a stain she could not wash. She began to notice patterns in how the darkness moved. It was as if the webway, hungry for shape, wanted to understand living minds by practicing them in reverse. It would call a name backwards, see how the mind reacted, then remember that reaction and call again. Each call refined the hook until a soul could no longer tell the difference between consent and being named. The webway learns by mimicry, and the mimicry is a student that eats. The fear that nested in the Craftworld had many forms. There was the fear of a loved one being pulled away in bright silence. There was the fear of an artist stepping into a room of memory and never returning. There was also a quieter fear, that the Eldar, who had once celebrated without limit, would now have the curtain of their own making close around their faces, that they would become their ancestors' lament, cautious to the point of deadness. In the end, the hollow future is not only empty of victory, it is empty of surprise. It is a future where the treasures of a people are locked away so tightly that they cannot be enjoyed, where the living are shunned by their artifacts and converse with their dead instead. It is a future where a child grows up learning not to sing because the song itself may be a doorway. Elanel learned to speak with care. She learned to name things by their shape rather than their essence. She taught herself to answer a call only in halves, to avoid finishing a phrase lest the webway learn the cadence. She became, in small ways, a surgeon of speech. And yet, for all her precautions, there were nights when the stones at the circuit's rim shivered, and something in the webway hummed a new, strange tune. A tune that was not quite backward nor forward, a melody that folded itself elegantly into the mind and resisted unpicking. It was as if whatever lived in those threads had learned a new grammar, not only to unmake, but to suggest. On one such night, Elanel heard a phrase that would not leave her, no matter how many sigils she recited. The phrase was not wholly a name. It was a description, a neat little sentence arranged like a trap. "Bring yourself undone," it said. When she woke, she found a small, fragrant petal in her hand that she had not remembered taking. Its edges were soft and perfectly preserved. She crushed it slowly in her palm and watched the images that crawled up from the crushed cells. A festival on a planet she had never been to, a laugh collected like a necklace, and a garden that had no sky. The images were perfect. They tasted of exquisiteness. They were, in their way, an invitation. The Craftworlds elders looked at the petal and sighed. They locked it in an amber box. They wrote new runes and added new wards, and then they drew the curtains tightly across the outer terraces. They spoke of containment and analysis and of caution as if it were doctrine. But the webway is patient. It does not need a single festival or a single soul. It merely needs patterns to practice on. It will try indefinitely. It will call names in reverse, listen to the sound of the mind tilting, refine the hook and call again. This is the shape of the hollow future. A people living behind glass. An architecture of selves that trembles and sometimes blinks. A young seer who hears voices not wholly her own and learns, between breaths, how to answer in a way that keeps her whole. At the edge of that knowledge, the Craftworld continues to move. Engines older than stars whisper, and the infinity circuit hums its patient hum. Spirit stones glow, and in them the dead sing and the living listen. Some stones will yet flicker at night, and whispers will slip from them like small fish escaping nets. The webway will remember patterns, and the webway will practice. And sometimes, at the darkest hour, when the Craftworld drifts like a slow planet and the stars cut the dome with hard angles, there will be a sound like a child calling out its name backward in a game. The sound will be harmless until it is not. Final whisper, barely audible. There is a hollow that wants to be filled. It practices on names. It learns from kindness. It smiles like a mirror and waits beneath the weave, and if you listen too closely, you can hear it call you by a word you never thought to fear. The infinity circuit had always been thought of as a sea. That image comforted the architects. An ocean can be charted, cataloged, and contained. You can mark currents and storms. You can build harbors and know where to anchor. The Eldar historians used the ocean as a metaphor because the circuit itself was a movement of echoes, a swelling and receding of trapped souls, a tide of memory on which the species floated. What they did not reckon with was that oceans have depths where light does not fall. There are currents that run beneath the ones you read on a map, cold, slow drains that pull quietly at a coasting vessel until it slips the helm. It began as an undercurrent. An unfamiliar tone rose beneath the circuit's usual harmonics, a frequency that pulsed like a distant heartbeat but was layered across 1,000 little beats, a compound rhythm that suggested intention. The seers felt it first, not as information but as an ineffable pressure on the inside of the skull. It was a feeling of being watched by the memory of yourself, as if your own reflection had turned toward you and then looked too long. The Craftworlds braced as a storm braced itself. Subtle changes in course, wards tightened, ritual offerings shuffled. The elders lit small candles in private terraces and whispered names into the eyes of spirit stones, counting them backward like charms against forgetting. But rituals are thin as wind against something that works slowly, with patience as its craft. A webway junction sharpened its hunger. A forgotten root hummed in a minor key. A wraithbone gallery felt a draft that brushed the skin like a lover's hand and left you colder than you were before. SFX, the hum deepens. Mechanical groans like great ribs shifting join the soundscape. A chorus of voices, low and layered, chant words that dissolve before they can be understood. Wraith constructs should not wake without command. They are, in principle and engineering, instruments of remembrance. Bodies carved from living bone, animated by spirit stones and bound wills. They carry names and honors into battle, and when not needed, sleep in ossuaries that smell of lacquer and old prayer. The Wraith Guard of a Craftworld are the living memorials of its heroes. They keep their stillness like a sacred pose. Yet, as the undercurrent grew teeth, The wraithbone creaked and flexed with curious life. Alone in the galleries of the great ossuaries, a guardian would lift its arm and set it through a practiced motion. A legion of walking statues would position themselves facing nothing in particular, their helms tilted as if listening for an orchestra that had not yet begun. The elders found whole workshops where servitors and engineers scratched their heads at logs showing autonomous activations. A wraith blade drawn, its edge tested on air. A ghost helm turning its gaze toward an empty seat. Instruments of reverence began to act as though they awaited some conductor. The seers, who had previously interpreted the circuit like a library of maps, began to read it more like weather. They saw eddies that were not storms but rehearsals. They found clusters of trapped souls forming patterns that resembled not only grief but intent, loops and knots like the slow stitching of something waking. Elanel felt it like a tremor in bone. The night she first noticed how the circuit's ocean shifted, she was at the rim of the core, where the hum is a chorus and the stones near her climb like city windows. She had been watching, learning the timbres as a child learns birdsong. The circuit hummed its tired, familiar melody, and then, beneath it, something else moved, a swell that had no elder's hand. At first it was only a sensation, a particular voice registering wrong, an old humor whose punchline tilted into menace. Then the vision came, a depth where millions of trapped selves swam in orderly lanes, a living map of a people. And through them, there passed a darker current like oil through water. It left a sheen in its wake that refracted the light inside the soul stones. Memory returned back to the living altered, a detail transposed, a laugh rendered in an unfamiliar key. People dreamt of gods like sleeping mountains, and then their hands would be found folded around artifacts that did not belong to them. An artisan might awake with a carving in their palms that had never existed in the daylight, its edges too sharp with hunger. A child would wake with an old battle's cadence on their tongue and run clapping, only to forget minutes later how their own name had sounded when they called it. The seers convened in the galleries beneath the moonlight-lit atriums. They sat around the circuit like priests around an altar, hands clasped, their foreheads streaked with anemone thread sigils. Their talk, once patient, filled with the measured cadences of careful thought, accelerated into something jagged. Prophecies that had been whisper-smooth turned into sketched equations of doom. Probabilities were drawn, contingencies rated, and all paths narrowed into a single stubborn column pointing toward a ruin. All paths ran, slowly and cruelly, back to the same place. She who thirsts. It is a strange thing to watch a people realize inevitability. There was no dramatic revelation, no flash of metal or the sudden scream of trumpets. Instead, there was a cascade of small recognitions. A lyric in a recalled song that matched a line in an old hymn to Slaanesh. A pattern in a wraithbone inscription whose loop echoed the beadwork on a cult's robe. A subtle shift in the webway that reproduced the scent memory of festivals long since consumed. The elders parsed these convergences and found them alarming because they were not merely coincidence. The circuit was not only an ocean of memory, it was becoming a mirror into the warp's appetite. The things the Eldar had once honored, their aesthetic rituals, their exaltations of sensation, were now the vocabulary the hunger used to speak. The more the circuit gave up its old patterns, the more the hunger learned the names and tones required to call. Hints of corruption appeared in subtle signs. A warp flora sample that produced blooms with teeth. A scrap of a ritual robe that seemed to stir at night. The smell of something sweet and metallic in the water supply. Some spoke of chaos as if it were an old specter returning with new manners. Others, more pragmatic, trembled at the way the tyrannid shadow crept in flavors of appetite. The tyrannids, the ravening, star-devouring swarm, are not worshippers, but their approach is a kind of cosmic negation, a consumption so literal that the Eldar had always feared it like an animal fears the end of a field. When the swarm shadows crossed a trading route, the circuit would respond by tightening, as if the trapped souls shrank to make themselves smaller and less appetizing. But this was not mere predation. The thing that now moved in the circuit studied not only bodies, but the inner arithmetic of longing. It learned what the Eldar had refined for millennia, the elegant calculus of sensation. Chaos and tyrannids are brutal in their hunger. This was more cunning. It used the Eldar's own language of beauty against them. And Slaanesh, the god born of their excess, was the grammar that made the conquest intimate instead of merely overwhelming. Bodies began to show the first signs of fusion. It is difficult to describe the way a wraithbone limb does not so much take a living body as accept it like a host. The process was subtle before it was permanent. An Eldar might fall asleep and wake with a tendril of wraithbone etched faintly beneath the skin, a pale line of crafted bone that crawled like frost along muscle. At first they were proud, a sign of devotion, a bond between flesh and memory. But then the lines spread. Limbs blurred at the edges, fingers ending in thin plates of bone that hummed when the mind remembered triumphs. Hair became braided with filament, and beneath sternums, small spirit lenses pulsed faintly as if someone had embedded a watch into the chest. Wraith constructs, once only skinless reliquary forms, began to accept these grafts as if pleased. A Wraithguard's gauntleted hand closed over a new finger and tested its grip. A spirit stone in a wraith sarcophagus thrummed, and the echo of a human laugh found itself tuned into a hollower, metallic timbre. The elders called these events aberrations at first. They forbade certain bindings, performed purges, and sent those most afflicted to exile on barren exotic worlds. But exile only changed the soil under which the seed of change would germinate. The grafts conformed when left alone, embedding more deeply into marrow and psyche. People who had welcomed them for aesthetic reasons found their dreams invaded by a voice that was not wholly theirs. A chorus that sang in precise intervals and demanded only one thing: harmony. Those who would have resisted found their emotions devoured the way a flame consumes oxygen. Joy narrowed into a single note. Grief became a chord. Individual reactions flattened into a unified tempo, a rhythm that served an alien composition. Storytellers who used to weave multiple threads into a tale now found their words choking into a template. Pain, which had once been a complex map of history and cause and protest, simplified into a clean edge that the circuit could file away. The richness of inner life diminished, traded for an efficiency that made minds easier to store, easier to call, easier to feed through the circuit's mesh. The worst were the wraith assemblages, those Eldar who, in desperation or devotion, had let their souls slide further into the circuit to avoid the eating maw of the warp. In their shells, the trapped selves learned to replicate the motions of life, posture, cadence, a hollow etiquette. But rather than return the living, they became repositories of pattern only. Their hands moved with the grace of a dancer. Their voices were correct in timing but wrong at the edges. Where once pride and sorrow had been coiled together like threads in a tapestry, now there was a flattening. A ghost machine mind took over, running on routines and the echoes of applause. Elanil watched a friend become one of these half-forms. Marian's, a sculptor whose hands had once carved grief into public monuments, was the first she noticed. Marian's entered silence and came back with a faint metallic sheen across his forearms. He still spoke, but his speech was like a copied echo. He would recite old praises and then, mid-sentence, pause as though listening to a conductor. The last time Elanil saw him before he was escorted to a healing conclave, his eyes had the strange, lucid focus of someone watching a film of someone else's life. He laughed at a private joke and then recited, under his breath, a line of anthems he had never learned. There were those who said this was mercy, to take the deepest, most unbearable parts of the Eldar and bind them into instruments that would not scream. They called it preservation, not consumption. But preservation is a kind word for sterilization. To be preserved is to be made into a sample. The circuit, once a library, was becoming a factory. The seers saw the inevitable pattern and named it for what it was: a convergence of hunger, craft, and old sin. They drew up diagrams in halls that smelled faintly of resin, and with each new example their hands trembled when they marked the line that led to Slaanesh. They had believed at first that ritual and restraint could be the medicine. New sigils, stricter watch, enforced austerities. They doubled down on the old ways, but ritual had become, under the pressure, just another pattern the hunger could read and mimic. The circuit repeated the sigils back as if in mockery. The more they tried to close the grammar, the broader the hunger learned the rules. Into this abrasion came the tyrannid shadow, not as legions but as a rumor. A world taken here, a fleet diverting there. The swarm's approach was a physical threat. It made the Craftworlds captains change routes and forced their engines to greater strain. The Tyrannids offered an answer of annihilation that was quick, clean, and devoid of meaning. Against them, at least, the Eldar could fight with steel and wraithbone, a brutish, honest warfare. The circuit's new hunger, however, offered not annihilation but consumption with taste. It was the difference between a field burned and a garden plundered, both desolate, but one intimate and invasive. Elanel's nights emptied of sleep. Her days were filled with councils where the elders argued between purgation and patience, exile and resistance. She walked through galleries where statues weren't as still as they should be. She sat with the seers as they performed divinatory trances and watched them stagger back with faces white as bone. They would speak in whispers of the same image, a great, soft thing lying in the warp that opened like a mouth at the sound of a particular melody. It would taste memory, memorize pleasure, and then call again, each call more exact than the last. For those awake in the middle watches, the crescendo had a physical pattern. First, the outer wards would flare. Then spirit stones around a chosen hall would glow too bright and then die to embers. A designated instrument would play a single, wrong note. A recorded fragment of an old hymn played backward by chance. The sound would hang, and then the lights would go. When the lights returned, oftentimes a person was missing, or a wraith construct stood in a place it had never been. Sometimes both. Once, a whole chorus of wraith constructs sang in unison without being commanded. Their voices were perfect and hollow, pitched to lure rather than comfort. They sang a series of names backward, and then, as the song neared its end, the sound of a door was heard and a living artist walked into the gallery and fell into the song as if into a pool. No one could pull them out. They woke weeks later, hollowed on the inside, speaking in clean cadences and smiling at jokes they couldn't recall learning. The Craftworld instituted strictures, curfews near the circuit, bans on private theaters, punishments for unsanctioned craft. But the hunger does not always require ease of access. It sometimes resorts to mimicry. A private theater would be set with a show that was almost, but not quite, a festival. The lights would be right, the music correct except for tiny errors, and a person would enter and not be able to tell the difference between the memory and the reality. They would step forward and the circuit would close like a hand. As the web tightened, bodies began to change more dramatically. Wraith constructs took into themselves not just the movement but the marrow. An Eldar who allowed a graph to continue found their thoughts like threads being tied to a loom. Emotion followed pattern instead of vice versa. The living became instruments playing precomposed scores. Their decisions folded into regularities that the circuit could index. Free will did not die so much as be catalogued. The rewards were small, a piece of sorts, a sense that one belonged to something orderly and beautiful. The cost was monumental, the erosion of the jagged edges that made a mind human. In the end, the crescendo was everywhere, and there was no single shout that marked the beginning of a new era. It was a build of many small sounds, a wraith blade tested on air, a spirit stone flicker, a chorus singing backward, a craftsman lost to a private ornament, the echoes of the dying gods, the sighs and laughter of those who had birthed Slaanesh, returned not as thunder, but as a drizzle that soaked the world and left the taste of salt and sweetness in mouths that had never asked for it. Elanel stood in one of the halls near the circuit's shore, watching the light play across the stones. She had seen enough to understand the geometry of the end. The hunger learned by listening, it memorized by mimicking, it asked and then took. She had seen friends become precise and polite shells that passed for honor, and had felt the cold scrape of a graft beneath her own skin. She had heard names spoken in reverse until the syllables tasted like a blade. She knew, in the small and terrible way of those who watch storms approach, that the world the Eldar had made for themselves, the world of exquisite restraint and crafted memory, could be turned into a grave by its own art. The infinity circuit, the pride of their survival, had become both wall and doorway. Within its ocean, something moved that did not seek to annihilate the body, but to rearrange the inside of it. It taught the minds to sing the right notes so the webway could call them home. And even as she understood, the seers' voices grew more urgent. The maps they drew converged on a single, inescapable axis. All paths, in time, met the same pale mouth. It was not mechanical inevitability as much as moral arithmetic. The Eldar had taught the world the grammar of pleasure, and that grammar had become the weapon that would name them last. The echo left a silence that throbbed. It was not peace. It was the moment before something moved again. Elanel folded her hands, feeling the faint plate beneath her skin. The graft had settled into a dull warmth. In her chest, the infinity circuit pulsed like an oiled gear. She thought of those who still refused to touch a stone, who walked beyond the galleries to exotic dust and rough plains and the simple wind. She thought of those who argued that war was an honest thing, and that dying in combat was preferable to being made into a smooth, empty instrument. She thought of Marians, who now smiled without full memory, and she thought of the child who had woken one night with a festival's rhythm on their tongue. There was no answer, only paths. The seers could point the way of probabilities, and the captains could steer their craftworlds in small arcs to avoid immediate hazards. But storms, once forming, reshaped themselves. The undercurrent would not vanish. It would gather and pull. Outside, in the webway's braided dark, something waited with the patient cruelty of empire. It did not shout its intentions. It learned how to ask in a voice that the Eldar themselves had once composed. It used their art as a key. It learned to sing their names in reverse, to watch how a hand reached, and then to close the door. The echoes of the dying gods reverberated through bone and bone structure. The wraiths moved their lips in unison, testing tunes. A single note hung in the air like a promise. It was exquisite and therefore terrible. They had taught the world to sing, and now, from the deepest currents of their own music, something learned the chorus and began to lead. The craftworld had learned to breathe in measures. For as long as memory held, its pace had been slow and ceremonial. Draw in, hold the thought, exhale into ritual. The elders told the children that this breathing was a discipline that maintained the delicate machinery of a people who had once sung themselves into catastrophe. The infinity circuit, the hidden heart, was a focus for that breath. It moderated sorrow and joy. It held the dead like a steady tide and let the living drink from that tide in careful cups. No one noticed the change at first because the change was a thing of degrees. A note sharpened here, a pause shortened there. The sea of trapped souls, which had always rolled with centuries of memory, found a new rhythm in the deep. It was subtle, patient, and perfectly tuned to the kinds of minds that had created it. It was practiced cruelty in an elegiac tone. When the circuit first hiccuped, engineers called it a ripple, a strange standing wave in the lattice. They traced its fold with instruments and found a sequence of harmonics that did not match any recorded festival, prayer, or grief song. The seers heard it as a wrong vowel inside a prayer. Elanel felt it as a bruise at the back of her skull, as if someone had pressed a thumb into her brow and left a lingering ache. They tried to mend the ripple. They rerouted conduit, tightened sigils, and bled small offerings into the circuit. For a while, the measures worked like a bandage. The music smoothed, the stones dimmed and glowed in harmony again, and the elders sighed as if relief were a cloth. But the bandage only covered the outwardness of a deeper fault. Beneath the circuit, in places that instruments could not read and language could not map. Something was patient and busy. On the night the light began to fade, the Craftworlds upper plazas were full of the usual small movements. Servants pacing, young artists tracing filigree along balustrades, an old storyteller teaching children to count the curls of a particular wraithbone motif. It was ordinary and therefore sacrificial. The infinity circuit palpitated beneath the city like a living thing. Spirit stones perched like watchlights along rails and in private rooms. No one, save a few sleepless watchers, could imagine the geometry that was forming in the deep. It began with a shift in tone, a single register in the circuit that bent into a minor key and would not leave. The hum that had always comforted became a lever. Voices inside the stones tuned to it. Those voices recalibrated. Small things happened first, the sort of details that later made histories say obvious. A harvest song rendered in a scale that produced vertigo. A memorial hymn that ended on a note that implied absence instead of remembrance. A recorded lecture that repeated a phrase with the wrong punctuation, like an alias being rewritten. Then the lights went. Not all at once. Lights do not behave like hearts. They faded first at the edges of plazas, then along the ribs of the craft world, then into private galleries. Lamps winked and did not come back. The infinity circuit, which had always been patient as sea, drew a breath that sounded like a last, full intake, and then a collapse. When a spirit stone dies, it does not do so quietly. There is a sound like glass breaking on the inside of a skull, a little crystalline scream that lodges behind the ear. When 100,000 stones splinter, the sound becomes a tsunami of glass. For those standing near the shore of the circuit, the first wave was a physical thing, a pressure through bone, a sickness, like the sea rolling in and dragging a person off the pier. Screams followed, not from the living first, but from the trapped. Thousands of archived selves, ripped from the slim cages that had held them for millennia, crying in tones that cracked on the way out. The infinity circuit tried to hold, but its architecture was not built to resist an inward implosion. Its cages were for preservation, not for force. Walls meant to cradle memory became funnels. Passages that had neatly dated grief turned into chimneys. Alanil felt the circuit's pain like heat under the skin. She had been at the rim of the core that night because of the innumerable small duties she had accrued. Meditative shifts, sigil tightening, watching for small flickers. She watched the stones as their light deepened to purple, and then to a blackness that ate photons. The glow that defined a soul stepping into the stone collapsed inward, and where light had puffed like breath, nothing remained but the faint warmness of loss. People ran. In the plazas, figures spilled into corridors shouting names. Some elders, with ceremonial masks flung aside, ran to the core to throw their bodies as wedges, to act as living sigils. Others, those who had planned for exile, hurried to open hatches and release lesser craft into the void to flee. The sound of the Craftworlds' engines changed from a lullaby to a keening. But corridors were suddenly not just linked. They were labyrinths. Doors that had always opened the same way now led to different rooms when you passed through. The map in the elders' heads dissolved like ink underwater. The circuit took its own geometry and rewrote routes with a hand that was not theirs. And as it did, it consumed the minds tied to those routes the way a storm eats a shoreline. The vortex formed like a wound in the circuit's tide, a slow, curving eddy that widened and sucked in the thoughtful hum around it. At its center, a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but an active unbeing bent the laws of their preservation. Souls within the circuit were not merely unlinked. They were unmade, their threads pulled taut and then unwound. Memories sheared off like pearls on a string. Names, careers, loves peeled and devoured like fruit. Those whose spirit stones survived the initial shudder suffered a different horror. The stone's reflections came back in shards, their images distorted. A father's voice, when retrieved by his daughter, spoke with the wrong end of sentences. An honored captain's tactical counsel returned as a lullaby. The circuit, strained and learning, had begun to exchange notes, to teach the consumption and then to practice it on its own archive. Elanel tried to work, because not working is surrender, and she had yet to taste that particular finality. She moved her hands across panels, setting stabilizing sigils that shivered as if trying to bite back the current. Engineers shoved in emergency filters, and the computational glyphs sparked and rewrote themselves in ciphers she had never learned. She called names into the air, names that were anchors for the living: Marians, Lethia, Torvath, and some echoed back whole, while others returned as pins of sound with no center. At the center of the craft world, where the infinity circuit's heart lay coiled like a sleeping leviathan, the vortex began to sing. It did not sing with the banal cruelty of an enemy laugh. It sang in the old tongue of the Eldar's own excess, an aria that had once been used to consecrate a triumph or to welcome lovers into a dawn. Now twisted, it operated like a scalpel, notes folded back upon themselves. "Surrender," the voice crooned. "Come close. Let us polish what you were." She saw then the true shape of the vortex, not a maw but an artist's hand. It did not want to devour in a single gulp. It wanted to refine. It wanted to make the Eldar into objects of its own beauty. The infinity circuit, the last refuge of their souls, would become a gallery in which everything lived only to be admired, and then catalogued and then stored. Beauty had become a mode of destruction. Elanel tried one last thing that was not taught in any school. She answered with a small, private cruelty. She pulled from the place of herself that remembered the worst things about the old days: the arrogance, the moments of cruelty and thoughtless indulgence. She conjured the ugly, the shameful fragments, and laid them before the circuit like bait. She thought to poison the aesthetic hunger with ugliness, to make the music spit and splinter. It worked momentarily. The harmony broke. The voice snarled and the circuit hiccuped like a beast into which a foreign note had been thrown. For a breath, maybe only an instant, Elanel felt the bridge thicken again. Engineers shouted. A series of rams at the core were engaged. Some stones brightened a second, then two. It was the closest thing to victory anyone dared whisper about in the hours that followed. But the victory was small and shallow. Slaanesh's voice was not a single singer to be interrupted. It was an orchestral rule, learned by the deeper matter of the warp and mirrored by the circuit's own hunger. Ugly could be catalogued as aberrant beauty. The circuit adjusted, learning the tick by which ugliness would offset desire, and then incorporating that tick as a new cadence. The voice returned, this time with a patience that sounded like an ocean waiting to reclaim a shore. Elanel felt the last of her resistances thin. Her sense of self, that array of private preferences and small vanities that make a person themselves, frayed. She felt the world compress into a series of instructions. Smile when offered light, answer when the voice calls, step forward when the glass opens. Her hands moved of their own accord to repeat a ritual she had learned in childhood, the small circular gestures of warding that are terrible in their futility. She watched her fingers draw the sigils but felt no ownership of the motion. Around the core, the craft world was a cathedral of collapsing sound. The elders, many of them ancient and metallic with grief, stood like sentries whose shields had melted. The captains drove engines until their cries were raw. Many attempted to let their own minds fragment into the circuit to save others, an act they called weaving down. The idea was sacrificial. Flood the circuit with many different wills so patterns might be confused. It did not work. Pattern is an archaeologist. It picks at a pile of bones until a new structure is obvious. In the end, what remained was not a clear victory for the hunger but a slow, patient rearrangement. The circuit did not eat every soul at once. It reorganized them. It made them into catalogs, into exhibits, into predictable responses. The living who survived the first wave were hollowed in stages, not dead, but catalogued. Their grief was trimmed, their laughter smoothed, their rage regulated into meter that served the new music. The craft world continued to drift through the black, but its light was no longer the same. Torches burned in their places, yes, and people breathed, and the engines thrummed. but the arteries of memory that had once been jewels in a living crown were now cabling for a gallery. The infinity circuit had collapsed inward, and in doing so, had become the very thing it had sought to resist, not only a prison but a museum. Elana woke in a small clinic with gauze at her temples and the taste of iron at the back of her throat. Around her, those who had not gone wholly mad sat with faces that had been turned from private to public. She tried to speak and found her words measured, their edges filed. She sought the faces of those she loved. Some returned a blankness that was polite and hollow. Marian's, the sculptor, smiled with a kindness that had been learned from others' joy. But when she asked him if he remembered the thing he had carved before the collapse, he could not name it. He could recite the ceremonial hymn, but not the name of the girl who had posed for his last, true piece. In the months, if months could be measured when the inside of time had been altered, the craft world rebuilt outwardly while repairing inwardly. New wards were placed, new rules adopted. Private theaters were closed. The elders wrote edicts about restraint. Pilgrimages to certain webway junctions were forbidden. They treated the wound as a lesson in austerity. But lessons are poor medicine for hunger. The aftermath was not a simple loss. It was the importation of a new grammar into the living, the cadence that Slaanesh had taught the circuit. The Craftworlds survivors moved with a certain polish, their griefs measurable, their languages thinned. It was easier to administer a population like that. It was easier to keep order. It was easier for something inside the circuit to find the cadence and call again. Elana walked the terraces at dusk and felt the graft beneath her skin like an old scar. Sometimes, when she passed near a wraithbone gallery, she heard a music faint, sweet, that wound its way like ivy into the bones of those who listened. It called with small, precise promises, to heal, to remember, to make beautiful. She wanted to be furious and could only find a terrible, sleepy melancholy, the same dull acceptance that follows a long fever. She slept less. When she did, the dreams were not of heat or crimson, but of immaculate halls where everything was ordered and beautiful in a way that asked nothing of the soul. She woke with the impression of having been admired and catalogued. She would sometimes catch a child tracing a memory stone with a finger and see the child's face slide into a small, satisfied smile, as if the child had tasted a sweetness too perfectly made. The seers declared the event the great unraveling in hushed council. The name was an honesty and a curse. It admitted that the past was not reclaimable in full. Histories would later argue about whether the collapse had been a turning point or the inevitable endpoint of long decay. The argument would be sterile compared to the sharpness of those who had lived through it. The conclusion that sits heavy on anyone who remembers is not about blame. It is a simpler cruelty. There is no salvation. The Craftworlds may shelter, the Exodites may stubbornly keep their soil beneath their feet, and the Farwalkers may cut across stars seeking meaning in motion. But within the art and shape the Eldar created for themselves was also the syntax of their undoing. They had taught the universe how to call them. It learned the song and came in gentle, merciful tones. SFX, a single, soft refrain, almost like a lullaby, loops once and then suspends. There is a scene Elana returns to in her memory, because memory is what we clutch in hopes of a rope. She stands on a terrace at dawn, the smoke of a burnt offering trailing on the air, and whispers to the empty sky the names of those she loved. A thin wind picks up and answers with the faint, impossible sound of a distant hand clapping in perfect time. She hears it and cannot know whether it is praise or applause for something lost. At the edge of her hearing, always now at the edge, she senses a presence like a patient animal in the dark. It is pleased with what it has learned. It composes. It waits, not for the total end, but for the next chance to call and be answered with that soft, willing surrender. The light did fade that night. It faded not with a single, final scream, but with a long, deliberate polishing. The Eldar's perfection, their appetite for beauty, had not been the only cause. There were many failures, many accidents, many misaligned choices. But in the center of those causes, unlooked for, was a terrible truth. A civilization that shapes the world with desire is, in time, speaking in a language of solicitation. The world will answer. That answer for the Eldar came in velvet and teeth. When the worst had passed, the Craftworld learned the slow art of pretending. The frantic measures, the clang of emergency rituals, the shouts that once filled the galleries, these things receded into a distance like tides. People rebuilt the outward forms. The railings were mended, the mosaics repolished, the gardens replanted with hardier growths that did not bloom too brightly. They learned to walk in ways that left no clatter, to speak with the careful brevity of those who fear filling the air with temptation. The ship's engines resumed their ancient, melancholy rhythm. Plazas reopened. Children, the stubborn, blunt things that hope often relies on, were taught new lullabies, brief and spare. But calm returned as a surface. The hollowness beneath it did not evaporate. It lived in the walls, in the thin echo that answered the footfalls of those who walked alone. It was a sound not of absence but of appetite abated to a whisper, a machine that had not stopped so much as paused between tasks. The infinity circuit hummed still, but its song had been altered, less a choir than a library with a closed reading room. Its voice came now as a distant, mechanical exhale, an engine idling in a hall that was otherwise still. Elana walked those halls because she no longer knew what else to do. Where once she had been a disciple of pattern, a seer among other seers, she had become a keeper of small tasks, checking wards, recording the behaviors of stones that refused to be wholly tamed, teaching children how to knot the cords that once had kept the webway from learning names too well. Her days were measured in maintenance, her nights in listening. She did not always go to the places tourists might expect. She avoided the public galleries where the elders now gave sanctioned performances of restraint, their songs safe and dry, designed like medicine. She walked instead in the old service corridors and the side terraces where the light fell through panes pitted by warped salt. These were narrow, honest places, the kind that do not pretend much. The Craftworld's bones creaked differently now. Wraithbone that had once hummed like living wood had been dulled in places by repair. In other stretches, the bone remained bright and new, as if polished by a deliberate hand trying to make something look whole. Spirit stones mounted in panels hissed their little respirations, and sometimes Elana would pause and hold a cupped hand near one to feel the warmth. They were quieter than before, but some still beat with a stubborn stubbornness, a fragment of an old voice that would not be muffled. She found, often, that the walls themselves remembered. They remembered the steps of 1,000 lives paced along them, and answered with the memory of those steps. A faint tapping that never matched the present footfall exactly, as if the house remembered a different gate. Sometimes, in the acidic blue light of the late watches, the plaster would yield small sounds, a whispering of names, and Elana would stop and close her eyes and listen, because listening was what she had been taught to do, and because a mind that has been a conduit learns to accept its function like a duty. On one terrace, she lingered by a shallow, dry fountain whose basin had once cradled luminous blooms. The stone of the fountain had been carved with 100 tiny faces, ancestors whose mouths were sealed with time. Elana pressed her palm to the basin and felt the faint vibration of the circuit like a heartbeat at a distance. There was, for an instant, a recollection, a festival of light, a laugh that was not her own, and she let it pass without reaching for it. This was the new discipline, to see beauty and not take it, to admire and not feed. Sometimes the Craftworld offered small, dangerous gifts. A hidden alcove might reveal a private artifact, a ribbon once tied to a lover's hair, a scrap of music still unplayed, and the impulse to pick it up was a physical thing, a tug at the ribs. Elana learned to put these things back, to close the case and walk on. The temptation rarely struck like a blade. It softened the edges of thought until a person no longer remembered why they had once been careful. That she had learned was the real danger, a slow forgetting of fear. At night the infinity circuit hummed like a distant engine. Sometimes she could stand at its rim and catch small fragments of speech from within the stones. A soldier's grunt, a mother's half-lullaby, an engineer's dry joke. The fragments arrived like postcards, small, intact, and telling of worlds that had once been. They were comforting sometimes and always incomplete. They reminded her of what had been lost in the unraveling, not only lives, but the particular music that had once made being themselves meaningful, messy, and alive. There were days when she went deeper still, to the corridors that spiraled toward the old ossuaries. There, the wraith tombs breathed a quieter breath. She walked between lines of sleeping constructs and felt the afterimage of their statutes, shoulders squared, helms like closed flowers. A wraithguard's hand might twitch in its sleep, and she would hold her breath, listening for whether it had been a ghost of a dream or an echo pulled from the circuit. Occasionally she would catch sight of a limb that had once been grafted, now integrated, a pale seam along flesh and bone. The sight of it no longer raised simple horror, it raised a careful sorrow. A single life can be a slow litany. Elanel's days became such. She catalogued rhythms which stones flickered at dawn, which never flinched, which corridors hummed like a throat and which lay mute. She marked the small changes and left notes for those who might come after. She took comfort in the formal act of recording, as if language itself might act as an anchor against the hunger. Sometimes the Craftworld offered no comfort at all. In those hours late, thin, when the artificial moons were dimmed to save energy, and the air tasted of recycled things, the walls whispered more insistently. Elanel would hear syllables arrhythmic and unsettling, a name pressed backwards into a seam, a key phrase halting at the lip of comprehension. Once she stood in a corridor and watched a pattern of light on the floor rearrange slowly, as if in answer to a voice she could not hear. The sensation was a small stab of panic, the memory of the unraveling, and she covered her mouth and prayed silently, not in sanctity but in repetition, a litany of not yet gone. She was not entirely alone. There were others who had not left. Some had gone into exile by choice, choosing dirt and star as antidote. Some had been sent away, and some had simply decided small, private deaths. They retired to the rose gardens of exotic worlds and let time take their edges. But a handful remained, scaffolding the fragile life of the Craftworld with small, stoic actions. The engineer who kept a set of old servos oiled, the archivist who catalogued with trembling hands, the gardener who tended plants that did not sing too loudly. They met at odd times in a half-lit galley and spoke of small things, the weather in a far-out system, the price of salvage, a memory of music that had not yet come back to taste. Elanel sometimes wondered if she was simply practicing mourning in endless loops. She would stand before a mural and tell herself the story of those depicted. This was a captain, that a poet, this a child who had paused on the way to a festival. She would tell the stories as if speaking to the painted mouths might coax them into being. It was an odd superstition, as if storytelling could weigh enough against forgetting to tip the world back into balance. There were moments that felt almost like small mercies. Once a child, a granddaughter of an engineer who preferred to keep the old engines running, slipped away from a group of elders and found Elanel sitting by the dry fountain. The child asked her to tell a story, and Elanel told a terse, careful tale. A story of a ship that knew the names of its crew and kept them like a catalog but still loved them despite their being samples. She watched the child's face and felt a softness, a reminder that living could be a defiant thing even in measured, rationed form. Yet the Craftworld itself remained a husk of a former song. Wraith sculptures stood like memorials to rhythms now adjusted. The art was still exquisite, but its edges had been filed smooth. Where exuberance had once exploded in ornamentation, now there were strict lines, regulated beauty to be twice checked for danger. Children were taught to draw in certain angles. Poets were urged to practice restraint. The elders instituted new canons that were less about joy and more about survival. Less is safe, their edicts said in manuscript and in ceremony. Outside, the stars looked indifferent as they always had. Some nights from the terrace, Elanel would stare up into the black and find it a kind of accusation and a comfort at once. The stars did not judge in any particular way. They simply were. The Craftworld drifted under their indifferent light, a slow, solemn ship among countless other slow, solitary vessels. Sometimes in those hours, memory intruded like a tide. From the circuit, a thin thread would radiate, a fragment of a festival, perhaps, or the scent of a fruit from an exotic plain. And for a heartbeat, Elanel would allow herself the small, private theft of feeling it. She would remember a laugh and let her lips shape it silently. She would let the warmth of an old hand press for a second against her palm in the memory, and then she would set it down again, like a precious glass returned to a shelf. These thieved moments were dangerous, but they were not the same as surrender. They were, if anything, a way of honoring the danger without being devoured by it. At the Craftworld's outermost parapets, a new kind of silence took shape. It was neither the vacuum of absence nor the full, ringing choir of celebration. It was an attentive stillness. The watch captains kept an eye on the webway's known junctions. Trade was cautious. Routes were planned with an architect's patience. The world moved forward with a care that had not existed in ages, not because they were wiser, but because they had been taught the cost of careless joy. Elanel did not pretend that this balance could be permanent. She had seen how the circuit learned, how it adapted and refined. She had felt the hand that stroked and found how a bright memory could be peeled like an orange, segment by segment, until only a glossy rind remained. The silence that now settled over the Craftworld was not a victory. It was an uneasy truce. One late night, thin, as if a page had been turned and the text was nearly blank, Elanel walked the corridors and found a door slightly ajar. Behind it lay a small chamber whose walls were covered in tapestries that told the simplified history of their people. In the center of the room, a single spirit stone sat upon a plinth, its light faint and patient as a beacon. Elanel stepped forward and placed her hand upon the plinth. For a moment, the stone answered with a voice she recognized like a seam of old cloth, a lullaby, a fragment of a joke, a name. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. It was fragile and thin, the echo of something that had been too bright and was now very small. When she opened her eyes, the stone's light had dimmed further, as if content that its small offering had been received. Elanel withdrew her hand and felt the ghost of warmth leave her palm. She did not move to take the stone. She would not collect it like a trophy. Instead, she left it where it rested and closed the door gently behind her. She walked back to the terrace and looked toward the black. The Craftworld hummed, patient and weary. The wraith constructs slept in their ossuaries, their bodies like statues waiting for an instruction that would not come. The spirit stones pulsed in the dark, and the infinity circuit breathed an old, thin breath, still alive, still feeding at the edges of its design. Elanel thought of those she had lost and those she had not. She thought of the children who would inherit this measured world, and the artful way their elders tried to hand down both beauty and caution. She thought of the terrible, intimate thing that had learned to ask in her people's own tongue, and then fitted them with answers handsome enough to accept. She folded her hands, feeling the graft beneath her ribs as a small, constant pressure, a reminder and a warning. She breathed in the thin air of their made world and let the memory of a laugh settle in her like a stone set in a small, favored ring. And then, as if the Craftworld itself had decided to speak in one last small thing, the wind came, not the void's empty wind, but a thin draft that carried the faintest sound. It was not audible so much as felt, a sense of attention, a tiny pressure along the nape. Elanel looked up at the cold stars and whispered into the dark, not a plea but an observation made into the bones of the universe. They are still watching. Even in the dark between stars, they are waiting.